Today we're diving into the first half of James chapter 4. Now, before we get into it, let's remember the big picture. James is writing a practical, wisdom-filled letter to Jewish Christians scattered across the region, probably around AD 45 or 50. And his whole theme is simple, but challenging. Authentic faith must be lived out in daily life. Now remember his line in chapter 2, faith without works is dead. And at the end of chapter 3, James warned about the tongue and how our speech reveals what kind of wisdom we live by. He contrasted the earthly wisdom, which is going to be selfishness, jealousy, demonic, with heavenly wisdom, which is pure, peace-loving, and gentle. Now chapter 4 flows right out of that. If we live by the worldly wisdom, the fruit is going to be this: conflict, pride, and compromise. And so James gets very direct about the root cause of quarrels and divisions, because relationships are central. The first part of chapter 4 is about relationships, and relationships are the very core of our faith. In John chapter 13, Jesus commands us, love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples. Our love for each other is evidence to the world that we belong to him. And that's why James sounds so frustrated here, because if we can't get these relationships right, our witness will collapse. So let's take a look at James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. And it says, what is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet, you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. James is blunt. And the conflict isn't out there with others, but James is saying it's in here. It reminds me of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 7, verse 5, where Jesus says, first remove the log from your own eye. Leadership expert John Maxwell puts it this way: you can look at others to place the blame, or you can look at yourself and discover your opportunities. You know, let's be honest, it's way easier to blame others than to be humble before God and allow him to put his finger on what needs to be changed in us. Now, James goes back on in chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. Again, I'm reading from the New Living Translation. And he comes right out and he says, you adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again. If you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. What do you think the scriptures mean when they say that the Spirit of God has placed within us is filled with envy? But he gives us even more grace to stand against such evil schemes. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Strong words, right? Now, James calls out friendship with the world as spiritual adultery. He sounds more like an Old Testament prophet than a New Testament writer. And that's intentional, because the prophets never sugarcoated sin. They spoke bluntly because sin was playing with fire. And James would rather wound with truth than to watch the church burn in compromise. But here's the beauty. Even in his harshest rebuke, James surrounds it with grace. But he gives more grace, verse 6. And verse 10 says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. That's the heartbeat of the passage. God opposes pride, but his grace is overflowing to those who will humble themselves. And so the takeaway is we live in a culture of narcissism and blame. And it's easy to point the fingers, play the victim, and justify our pride. But James calls us back to humility focus on our own heart and motives, not everyone else's failures. A teachable, repentive, and humble heart glorifies God and restores relationships. Now, next week, we're going to pick up in verse 7, where James shows us how to get the devil off our backs, and he reminds us that time is short, and you don't want to miss it. Well, we're going to throw it back into the small groups. There's plenty to talk about, and I look forward to connecting again next week.